This video is brought to you by the University Writing Center, a unit of the Department of Rhetoric and Writing at the University of Texas at Austin. You can contact us at uwc.utexas.edu.
Hello, my name is Cody Jarman, and in this video I'm going to be introducing you to the concept of rhetorical moves and talking with you a little bit about how those rhetorical moves can help us identify some of the primary purposes of the academic abstract as a genre of writing. And we'll also be reflecting a little bit on how discipline influences our approaches to writing academic abstracts. So hopefully, by thinking a little bit about rhetorical moves and the rhetorical purposes of the abstract as a genre of writing, we'll all be able to think a little more carefully and deliberately as we write our own abstracts and as we read abstracts when we do our own research. So let's get started. To begin with, one of the sort of foundational texts on the academic abstract, or really on academic writing in general from a rhetorical perspective, is Jonathan Swales' 1990 text, Genre Analysis. In this text, Swales forwards four main moves, rhetorical moves, that are generally made in abstracts. These include the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion and conclusion. These four moves probably sound familiar as four of the primary sections of the standard research article, especially in the STEM fields. And this is because Swales argued that the abstract is primarily a summary document, and therefore it essentially creates the shape of an academic article in miniature. So in order to learn a little bit more about what moves look like and how these miniature versions of academic article sections look, we'll look at an abstract together quick. So to begin with, I'm going to read this sample out loud. During the excavation of tunnels, the high-stress environment in which the tunnel is located will make the tunnel prone to collapse. In order to reinforce tunnel, the supporting structure is usually used to bear the stress released by the tunnel environment. In this paper, the supporting structure in tunnel engineering and foam concrete, which is a kind of high-performance concrete, are briefly introduced. The foam concrete is poured into the supporting structure as the seismic layer to improve the performance of pressure relief and seismic resistance, and the simulation analysis of the performance of pressure relief and seismic resistance of the supporting structures of the tunnel poured with foam concrete seismic layer is carried out by the ABAQUS finite element software. The results show that the performance of pressure relief and seismic resistance of the supporting structure of the tunnel poured with foamed concrete seismic layer are improved, in which the seismic resistance increases with the increase of the thickness of the seismic layer and then tends to stabilize. In summary, the supporting structure of the tunnel poured with high-performance concrete has higher performance of pressure relief and seismic resistance. Now, for those of us who aren't engineers, I imagine that was not a super clear piece of writing to hear read out loud. But actually, if we apply Swales' moves to it, we can pretty clearly and quickly organize this abstract and see what's going on. So let's look at those. So first, we can identify the introduction. The introduction to an abstract works very similarly to the introduction of an article, outlining the main subject and topic. Here we see that right here at the beginning. During the excavation of tunnels, the high-stress environment in which the tunnel is located will make the tunnel prone to collapse, gesturing towards a problem. And then in order to reinforce tunnel, the supporting structure is usually used to bear the stress released by the tunnel environment, and gesturing towards a specific concern, the supporting structure. Then we move on to a larger methods section. And as you can see, this simply summarizes steps taken in the paper and steps taken in the experiment that the paper is describing. Then moving on, we see a results section, very clearly flagged by the authors of this abstract with the phrase, "the results show." So we can see that here we're going to discuss what we learned while looking at this experiment. And then finally, a miniature discussion section. In summary, the supporting structure of the tunnel poured with high-performance concrete has higher performance of pressure relief and seismic resistance. So what we have learned from the methods and results, and sort of a slight gesture back to what we pointed out in the introduction to the topic at the beginning of the abstract. Swales' model of talking about abstracts is really useful, but more recent rhetoricians have suggested that the rhetorical purposes of the abstract are slightly more complicated and are not purely summative. A few people to keep in mind include Hyland, who has suggested that abstracts are actually written to persuade readers that the article is worth reading, a sentiment that has been echoed by other critics who say that the abstract borrows persuasive rhetorical moves associated with article introductions, such as centrality claims and observations about gaps in current knowledge. These more recent scholars of rhetoric have suggested that the abstract does not only summarize the article, but also convinces you to read it. Let's look a little bit at a system of moves that models that. So here we can see Hyland's adapted rhetorical model for abstracts. This is still following Swales' basic idea that there are moves being made in an abstract, but instead of saying that the moves exactly replicate that of the article, Hyland complicates it a little bit. So now we see the introduction, which is broken down by establishing territory, establishing niche, and occupying niche, is much more complicated than it was in the original Swales model. Then we see an added purpose section, which obviously has a persuasive element because we're seeing more about why it's important that the study is being done. Then we see the methods again. We see the product, which does bear relation to the results, right? But does have a more persuasive focus, as in there's a product, there's something to be gained from this study, this research. And then finally, a conclusion, which parallels pretty closely with Swales' discussion. Let's look at what an abstract looks like whenever we read one using Hyland's move model. So to begin, I'll read this abstract aloud as well. In 2007, we argued that when it comes to sociology of education, the lives and education of refugee children were invisible. Sociology of education was a wasteland as far as studies of the social effects of migration were concerned. Here we revisit this argument, exploring whether education and migration has been developed into a viable specialism in the discipline, and whether one of the great societal challenges of our age is being addressed. Examining the work published on migration and education since 2005 in BJSE, we see that the majority of studies focus on the global mobility of students and on school experiences of migrant children. While these are valuable foci, what is missing is a more extensive consideration of how the age of migration and the characteristics of global migration in the 21st century challenge the values, the policies, and practices associated with state education institutions and social order. So let's see what this looks like as we map out the move. Here we have the introduction, but we do see that this is an introduction with a very clearly persuasive focus, right? So in 2007, we argued that when it comes to sociology of education, the lives and education of refugee children were invisible. In this instance, the authors are actually pointing to their own previous work to outline that territory that Hyland referenced in his more detailed version of the introduction. So sociology of education was a wasteland as far as studies of the social effects of migration were concerned. There again, we see that gap, right? That niche that's going to be occupied by these authors. Then moving on, we can look at the purpose statement, where the authors are pointing out that they're going to revisit this topic in the hopes of seeing what has changed in the meantime since they sort of established the territory in their previous work. Then we see methods, which is a very simple and short statement in this particular example. And then we see the product, what they learned from having completed this study using the methods they outlined, which interestingly is rolled into their method statement in a single sentence. This is a rhetorical technique that's occasionally used that really almost implies the inevitability of the results. By combining your methods with your product statement, it makes the method seem like the most appropriate way to complete that particular activity. And then finally, a conclusion, which again has some very strong persuasive language, stressing the need for continued research in this area. Now that we've recognized how we can use moves to identify the summative and persuasive components of an abstract, let's talk a little bit about how different disciplines focus on different move sequences. Now, Hyland, the same author who forwarded the move sequence we just looked at, did a study of 800 abstracts across 8 different disciplines and actually found that the way disciplines use moves varies vary widely. So just as an example here, we see only 10% of all abstracts use the entire move sequence, so used every single section that we identified with that sample earlier. 94% included product statements, so product, proving that the study produced something, proved to be very relevant across most disciplines. However, as you look further down, you'll see that the variations are quite marked otherwise. 60% of physicists and engineers used a purpose methods product sequence. 75% of humanities and social science writers use introduction purpose products sequence, quite different from the engineers version. Introductions appear in 60% of what Hyland termed soft discipline abstracts versus 30% in hard discipline abstracts. And methods appeared in 60% of soft discipline abstracts versus 30% of hard discipline abstracts. So let's talk a little bit more about those soft versus hard discipline variations. First off, just as a general sort of way of thinking about what Hyland means by soft versus hard disciplines tend to be the more sort of specifically applied disciplines, so something like, say, civil engineering, whereas soft disciplines tend to be slightly more theoretical. This is Hyland's terminology for organizing these different. So Hyland sort of makes some suppositions, some hypotheses about how the focus of these different disciplines influences the move sequences you see in the abstracts, pointing out that hard disciplines assume a well-informed reader who takes worth of the work for granted, and that's why you would see a lack of those kinds of purpose statements that we talked about with biomedicine. Purpose statements often combined with methods in a single sentence to suggest suitability, sort of like what we discussed earlier with the combination of methods with product, with the sample abstract we looked at. And finally, they tend to defend research by arguing for novelty and utility. Soft disciplines, on the other hand, spend more time defending their niche and tend to make purpose statements that outline coverage without making as many particular claims, and tend to be particularly focused to an in-field crowd where they're talking about debates within the discipline. So they're not as focused on speaking to people outside of the discipline in general. Finally, another researcher, Samraj, found some other general variations in how abstracts function and what rhetorical moves they rely on. Samraj suggested that certain disciplines tended to emphasize the persuasive moves, whereas others emphasized the process moves. So basically, some were more given to persuasion and some were more given to summary, based on the sort of Swales-Hyland comparison we talked about earlier. The disciplines given to persuasion, according to Samraj, were emerging fields, so fields that were fairly new, like, say, digital humanities, interdisciplinary fields, and specifically applied fields, like engineering or medicine. While mature fields, like biology and English, traditional fields, like chemistry and history, and theoretical fields, like philosophy and sociology, tended to be more likely to emphasize process and emphasize summary in the structure of the piece. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope it taught you something about rhetorical moves and how they feature in abstracts. I hope that you could maybe take some of these move models that I went through, maybe the Swales version, maybe the Hyland version, and try to map out your own abstracts to see what moves you're maybe making, or maybe consider what your discipline is. Is your discipline an emerging field? Is your discipline one given to summary, or is it one given to persuasion? If it is given to summary, or if it is given to persuasion, how can you lean into that as you write your own abstracts? Or how can you use these rhetorical moves to maybe make it a little easier for you to read abstracts so that you can learn what an article is doing more quickly and more effectively as you gather your own research? Ultimately, I hope this video was very helpful for you. Thank you so much for watching.